Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Cross, for meeting with us. Appreciate that. We're interested in telling, is part of our story, the history of the evolution of our relationship with code. And there's parts of our story that go through some of the early writing systems, but the main thing starts with the alphabet. And so what I'm really interested in is the story of the alphabet, your view of how it evolved and what you've discovered in your work and research. And before we talk about that, what I'd really like is for you to take a few minutes and describe yourself. Why is it you're interested in this? How did you come to this? Your career at Harvard, your research interests, and then we'll go from that background to specifically what we can say about the alphabet.
I suppose it began when I was in theological seminary. They required, my background is Presbyterian, they required Greek and Hebrew. And I protested against this requirement and led a group of students protesting, and we lost. So I had to read Hebrew and became absolutely enchanted with Hebrew poetry. Went on to a degree in Semitic languages at Johns Hopkins University, and then have moved on in research in a number of areas, in history of religion of Israel, in Semitic epigraphy, and particularly the group of languages, Ugaritic, Phoenician, Hebrew, Aramaic, that group. And a good deal of my work has been to establish a typological sequence of the dates of the scripts of these inscriptions, to decipher them when they needed decipherment. And along the way, I moved from the beginnings of the alphabet all the way down to the Roman period and my interests. If you want to move on now to the alphabet, I'll be happy to do. Okay?
Sure, that's great.
The writing systems of the ancient Near East, the original ones were all pictographic and syllabic in character. In Akkadian, cuneiform scripts, you had well over 300 signs being used to write, and many more than that actually available. Moreover, each of these syllabic signs had multiple values. For example, one had the significance ud, ut, tu, tam, par, pir, hish, hish. Now, which one of those values you took depended on the context in which you were reading. So that reading and writing became the work of a tiny elite, usually around the king or around the temple, and ordinary folk simply did not have the time and often did not have the intelligence to be able to solve such a complex system. The same is true in Egypt with the Hieroglyphic Scripts. In Egypt, you actually had some signs which were each letter of their sound system, what you call a pseudo-alphabet, but they never used it. They used instead signs which were 2 letters or 3 letters, and again, syllabic signs. So again, the monopoly of writing and reading was for the ruling elite. And it was not until roughly 1800 BC that someone in Palestine, probably, in Phoenicia, Palestine, conceivably in northern Egypt, had a brilliant idea. Why not use one symbol for each consonant? Simplification is often a basis for amazing inventions, and this was a case of utter simplification of a very complex system. They used pictographs picture of an ox, for example, for the letter Aleph, a picture of a house for bait, alphabet for the alphabet running through. And these pictures are immediately recognizable in the earliest of these inscriptions. Then these pictographs became stylized, and eventually you could not recognize what the origin was. And became simply the letters we know in the Greek and in the English or the Roman alphabet.
This is the acrophonic?
I beg your pardon?
Acrophonic?
It was an acrophonic principle,
Right,
yeah.
so that originally we're looking
A for apple, B for banana. In this case, Aleph was for ox, Beit was for house. You know the word Beit from places like Beit El and Bethlehem, and on through the alphabet. We had not solved the meaning of all these pictographs until very recent years, and even now there are one or two consonants we're not certain of. I had the luck to discover the origins of the of the letter Zion, a Z. So the end of the alphabet, well, Z is not their end of the alphabet. The end of their alphabet is Tav, T. But and certain other signs have been only in fairly recent years recognized. The original system was about 28 consonants. That then narrowed to about 22 in Hebrew, Phoenician, and the scripts of that period, Aramaic. This alphabet radiated out from wherever it began, perhaps in Phoenicia. It radiated out to the various languages in which this came to be used. There was a peculiarity of Semitic languages, particularly of these West Semitic languages, which made this system wonderful. Every syllable began with a consonant. And the vowel system was very simple. You had only 3 vowel areas. And therefore you could write only with consonants. And it would be intelligible. And then all you had to do was learn 22, 28 pictures, and you could read. And if you could draw, you could write. Now, I don't know how long it took an ancient, let's say, Hebrew speaker to learn the alphabet and to read and to write. But it did mean that increasingly knowledge, literature became democratized. Ordinary folk could read. And once you could read, it began to qualify the power of the king and his associates, and of the high priest and his associates. The prophetic movement is not surprisingly from a period which is alphabetic. You can have a critique of king and temple once you have people who can read and write. So that then reading and writing began to spread very fast. When I say very fast, I'm speaking of centuries, not of not of a week or months. Now, the Semitic system, which fitted language with its structure, with the consonants beginning syllables, and with a simple vowel system, this wouldn't work when this was borrowed by the Greeks. It's just incredible. It's very, very awkward. So the Greeks immediately began to invent vowels. They used certain of the consonants to indicate vowels. And actually then, somewhere around 1100 in the Semitic world, you began to get a few vowels marked, particularly the final vowel of a word would be marked. So then we finally have, stemming out of this consonantal alphabet, the full alphabet to mark every sound, every phoneme in the language. And that's where we are now.
Let's go. I noticed that you, Deanna, do me a favor, come over here and sit. That you said wherever it came from. We'll sit comfortably. There's been a number of publications that I've encountered that suggested that the alphabet, the earliest known form of the alphabet, is in a Hebrew tribe.
I'm sorry, I must speak more loudly.
Tell me about what you know about the oldest, earliest alphabet. Where was it found?
For many, many years, we had what we call the Proto-Canaanite alphabet, appearing only in Sinai and in Palestine and southern Syria. Very recently, even older forms of the alphabet have been found in Egypt, done by West Semites who apparently were slaves in Egypt. That's why when I was speaking, I said it's not impossible that the occurrence took place in Egypt. But whether it took place in Phoenicia, which is what I really think, or in Egypt, it was certainly under the influence of Egyptian writing. They knew the system of writing, and whoever had this brilliant stroke realized that within the Egyptian system you actually had the basis for an alphabet. And again, pictographs were the basis, and you can trace relationships between a number of the early Proto-Canaanite pictographs and Egyptian hieroglyphs. The house looks very much like the Egyptian hieroglyphic for house. And so on, you can go down. The sign for the letter M, for example, is a wavy sign because it's the sea. And you see the relationship between these two. They're not always, the value may not be the same, but the pictograph has continuity from one to the other. So there was an Egyptian inspiration, but it was not done by the Egyptians. They had all of the materials to do it, but apparently failed. And all of these inscriptions which we have, the earliest of them, are written in Canaanite, that is, if you wish, an ancestor of Hebrew and Phoenician, which are Canaanite languages.
Some have drawn attention to the fact that there's an intersection between the emergence of the alphabet and Moses' story, the Ten Commandments, the beginning of
Yes.
the Old Testament writing system and all that.
There was even one scholar who thought that this material was invented precisely in that period. We now have much older examples of the alphabet. As I say, 1800 probably is roughly in the Hyksos period, the Egyptian Hyksos period, when many Semites were in Egypt, that we probably had its invention. But it was available, if you wish, at Mount Sinai.
Right. So that the event of making the written word such a powerful part of culture seems to begin there in that culture anyway.
Well, the evolution of culture is remarkable in the two major alphabetic societies, in the Hebrew society and in the Greek. When you have the spread of the alphabet and it's becoming popular and widely used, you have the basis for logical thought, for example. You have the basis for critical thought. If you have a totally oral culture, things pass quickly by you. You cannot analyze very well. Once you have something that you can read easily, these powers began to operate. It is an extraordinarily powerful tool, and I would put the invention of the alphabet among, if you wish, the absolute cardinal inventions of all of human history. what would you compare that would be more important in the evolution of culture? I don't know. You could say Gutenberg's and printing.
Which is only made possible by the alphabet.
Sorry?
Which is only made possible by the alphabet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why we call our series Children of the Code.
Uh-huh.
And that this invention, this alphabet, this code, is, as McLuhan once said, the mother of all invention. Marshall McLuhan?
Yes, surely.
Right? He called it the mother of invention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair statement, yeah. You did have these old writing systems, and of course, China, the Far East, had these complex writing systems. You had a group of them which we have not yet deciphered, but these almost necessarily gave monopoly of culture to a very few scholars, and the scholar, for that reason, had a very high rank in society, which has steadily gone down.
The dictator to dictate.
If you like that piece, my sentence you said.
So,
Speaking of the power, being able to write things. I just wanted to let you know that.
well, she was just saying that your hand brushed against the microphone
Oh dear.
last time. Well, that's okay. Well, when it does, it kind of obliterates the audio quality, right? And you were just making an important point, which was how the alphabet, again, you said it earlier, is democratized the flow of information, as opposed to this scribal elite, having control of everything, and the effect that had. I mean, that the two core elements of civilization, as we understand it, is the Hebrew and the Greeks. And everything seems to come from them, and both of them are alphabetic civilizations.
Yeah.
So if you want to speak, could you speak to that again, that point?
Yes. The old writing systems, exceedingly complex, could be used only by a scribal elite, and these usually under the dominance of the king or of the temple. With the invention of the alphabet and the spread of literacy, which was relatively fast, you had the possibility for what I've called the democratization of culture. Once you have a simple writing system where people of all levels can read and write, you have controls on power which you've never had before. Once you have literature, law, frozen into simple writing systems, they can be analyzed, thought about. You may have a critique of the message, let's say, of national messages which are put out to the people, if it's in simple writing that people can read and analyze. So that the birth of logic, it is not surprising, comes with the alphabet. The beginnings of the critique of king and temple, of royalty and priesthood, begins with the extensive spread of alphabetic learning. Yes, you have the emergence of the new possibilities of analysis, the possibilities of spread of the use of literature, law, history to a wide group of people. I think it was much easier to read and write in the 8th century BC than it is today. Everything was phonetic. Compare that with English spelling today. And to be sure, English could not be written only consonantally, as these ancient systems were, but we could be a bit more phonetic, I guess. The attempts at that, for example, in the Chicago Tribune, have not been happy.
We just interviewed the president of the Theodore Roosevelt Historical Society. If you're familiar with spelling reform attempts, the last great spelling reform attempt died in 1906 because of a mistake Theodore Roosevelt made, and that the newspaper is attributed to being a money-making scheme of Andrew Carnegie. So we're very interested in this whole story. That's where the connection to John Fisher I mentioned earlier, and the emergence of English, and how a handful of scribes, again, in the 1430s, working for King Henry V, who spoke only Latin, are transcribing this peasant language called English to develop what would become the writing system that you're describing.
Yeah.
Right? And one of our favorite things, maybe you can speak to this, because we've never found actually the citation, it's supposed to be in the Republic somewhere, that Plato said, in our day, once we knew the letters of the alphabet, we could read, which is the point you were making, that there was no internal assembly required to read.
Yeah,
You just
right.
saw the letters, said the sound, or heard the sound, and blended it together, and that was reading.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that point?
Well, I was going to mark on that George Bernard Shaw was another who wanted to simplify writing. The other side of the story, they say it would be marvelous to have completely phonetic writing, poor kids in school and whatnot. The other side is that our complex system of spelling gives us a great deal of historical knowledge about the evolution of English, so that linguists love to have this remnants, if you wish, of older pronunciations, older forms of English.
It also helps the speed reader. The Latinate cells that are inside these words, that you can track the meaning of a word you've never encountered before.
Yeah, that's right.
But
yeah.
we got 100 million people in this country whose lives are diminished because they're not reading well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's connected to this story.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking a little about other languages which have far more phonetic systems of spelling. I think Italian is much better off than we are. You remember Twain's remark about French, that the French can spell much better than they can pronounce. In any case, English is a very complicated spelling system, and
Yeah, there's this collision. One of the interesting things is when the Greeks get the alphabet, they recognize that it doesn't quite fit their sound system and add letters.
yes, so it became more complicated. It's interesting. The simplest is at the beginning, and it becomes complicated as
different sound systems try to match up.
right.
With those
Yeah.
letters.
And then we add punctuation, though this gives clarity, but also complexity. You've probably seen the recent bestseller concerning punctuation. If you have it, it's a marvelous book. The woman who writes it is a very witty lady, as well as interested in this whole topic. What is the name of it? It's not the koala bear, it's one of the Australian animals, eats, aims, and shoots. That's not quite right either. In any case, it's a play on words in which the animal in question eats shoots, and so on. But if you read it, it looks like you have someone who's aiming and shooting and killing in the title. All of it depends on a comma, which way you read it.
Ah, clever. Good. What is it, Seneca or Quint? The Roman who is responsible for kind of driving punctuation. That when they get the writing system from the Greeks, it's all just run together. There's no separation. Could you speak to that, the difference between the Greeks and the Romans and the introduction of punctuation?
Well, I'm sorry. This is another complication. In the material which I'm deciphering right now, 7th century Phoenician, you have word dividers. You have a point which is put between words. Not only the words separated, but you actually have markers. And that goes back at least to about 1300 that you would occasionally use these markers. The Mesha stone, the famous stone of the Moabites in the 9th century, has both word dividers and paragraph dividers. So the notion of punctuation starts earlier. But then in Greek you have this continuous writing, which is no separation of words. It's very difficult to read, to figure out if you're a non-speaker. And this persists. And then slowly you have introduction of this and that and the other sign. And the book which I was speaking about gives a history of precisely when each thing is introduced, each new diacritical mark, each new punctuation sign. So again, it goes up and down over history.
For the most part, the idea of spaces between words, though, in the way that the writing system that we use, from my understanding is the Romans introduced spaces between words after they get it from the Greeks, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
But as I say, already you had a system early, they dropped.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the Greeks' basic contribution is the vowels.
Vowel system, yeah.
Right. Maybe you could speak to that. The Greeks get the alphabet from the Phoenicians. Do we know anything about how they got it or where they got it or
This is
when they got it?
a subject of great controversy, and I'll give you my views.
Okay.
They apparently borrowed it in the Western Mediterranean, where the Phoenicians were quite active. The oldest form of the scripts we have are from the island of Thera, earliest Greek inscriptions, borrowing the alphabet from the Phoenicians. Typologically, that's the earliest. Probably in the area of Crete that the actual borrowing took place. And we have inscriptions in Crete in Phoenician going back to about 1,000. I think the borrowing took place in the 11th century, probably the late 11th century. Now, there were some secondary influences on the alphabet later, on the Greek alphabet, so that some of the signs resemble most 11th century Phoenician. Other signs look a bit more like 9th century. And there's another school of thought who wants to put now the borrowing actually down in the 9th century or even later. Part of the problem here is that there is a blank in Greek inscriptions in this early period. And so what we have to do is try to see at what stage the Phoenician alphabet was evolving, which is represented by later Greek, the shape of later Greek signs. The Phoenicians plied the seas in a period before the Greeks were active, and this, I think, is the context of the borrowing. It is not borrowed by land or by Greeks in the Orient. It seems to be a phenomenon from the seafaring Phoenicians that passed it on then to the Greeks and the Mediterranean.
So a consequence of trade, no doubt, more likely, between the Phoenicians and their seafaring routes, encountering Greeks, and the Greeks seeing them use it, and that kind of
Yes.
thing.
There are Phoenician inscriptions all over the Mediterranean, Sardinia, even Spain. They very much were after silver, but so-called ships of Tarshish in the Bible, referring to particularly to Solomon's fleets, are actually part of this Mediterranean littoral as a seafaring area, which Israel didn't participate much, but some, in which the Phoenicians were the great pioneers. I once spent time in Sardinia doing underwater archaeology, looking for remains of Phoenician harbor installations. And we found some. Phoenician boats have been found also off the coast of Palestine, off the coast of Turkey. The Harvard expedition has 2 ships lying off of Ashkelon, which they would like to dig. They're too deep for scuba divers, much too deep, but there are now systems whereby they can go down with these new devices and work. So these were merchant sailors, and they brought their alphabet with them.
They weren't using it as much for poetry, and
I'm sorry?
the Phoenicians, their use of the alphabet was less for poetry and religious writing, and more for commerce and.
It was certainly very much part of commerce, but from the 14th century, we have alphabetic texts of poetry, the great myths of Ugarit, as well as business documents, letters, and other things. But we know more about Canaanite religion, in which Israel's religion was born, so to speak, the context, from these literary documents. The problem with Phoenicia is we usually only have preserved either inscriptions inscribed in stone or these potsherds in which they write on. We would expect the literature to be on papyrus, or perhaps on leather, and in either case destroyed. The reason why the Ugaritic corpus is preserved is they invented still another system whereby they had a set of signs in cuneiform script, but alphabetic. So it's cuneiform alphabet. This means they used tablets which lasted, which survived, and in the city of Ugarit they've been pouring out. The same system is found once or twice in Cyprus and in Palestine, but the main corpus we have is from this North Syrian side of Ugarit on the coast of Mediterranean. So I think we should not say the Phoenicians did nothing but use their alphabet for business purposes. I suspect they also very much used it in documents that are destroyed and lost. Papyri we can get in Egypt where it was so dry. The so-called Dead Sea Scrolls were found in arid caves on the shore of the Dead Sea. That can be preserved. I was involved in the discovery of the Samaria papyrus, their 4th century legal documents, which again had been buried by fleeing Samaritans, or Sumerians, whichever you want to call them, people from Samaria, in caves in a cave, I should say, in the Jordan Rift, and again arid country, But in the main centers of civilization, in Syria, Palestine, you don't have these things preserved. And Israel, for some reason, did not do much engraving on stone. They usually, so we gather, plastered a stone and then wrote in dipinto, painted the inscription. We have a literary document from Transjordan, which has to do with now the name has jumped out of my head. At my age, this happens sometimes. Well, it's an 8th century literary document concerning a prophet who's named also in the Bible. So, in this case, we have plaster with painting surviving, and one site from Egypt, Untitled Chapter, we have also plaster inscriptions. One lovely one talking about the battles of Ale and Baal. We wish we'd had the old text. We don't have a great deal. But again, literature existed. And I think we are simply unlucky that they didn't do all their writing on clay tablets.
Right. So it seems that what's the effect of the alphabet on the Hebrew people? In your opinion, what's the effect of becoming becoming users of this alphabet on the Hebrews as a people?
Well, we could begin by saying the prophetic literature, which was given orally, at least among the early prophets, was put into writing. And to some degree, this is the stimulus which creates who we are, our ethical values, our understanding of ourselves and our society. It is a major movement which precisely spans the interval between transmission orally of literature to written form.
They really are people of the book.
Yes, this emerged slowly, the book, but it did emerge, and we have ancient literature which survives in it. Oral literature still maintained status, and the ancient bards who carried religious poetry were very important, even down as late as the exile. But after that, it is the religion of the book, and things are written, the poetry is written. The later material in Isaiah is written poetry, imitating to some degree the old oral styles, but oral poetry is now a thing of the past. Something similar with Homer.
Yes, I was going to
Yeah.
say. But the Hebrews are really the first people who share a kind of common connection through a book. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And so Homer also, what can we say about Homer and the alphabet? The timing of that?
Homer's poetry has now been well established as wholly oral in origin. But at some point it was written down. The Ugaritic tablets that I was talking about, that was orally composed and then dictated to a scribe by the bard, or if you wish, the religious poet, whatever you want to call him, the epic singer, dictated. We even have the name of the king who sponsored the dictation and the writing down, and the name of in this case, a priest who sang the song that was being written on clay tablets. So the transition we can visualize very nicely. Now, I don't know where I started on this.
Well, we're going into Homer.
Yes. So Homer was oral, and he was put down into poetry, and the Homeric Cycle was sung at the great religious festivals, which are part fair and part religious, so that there were national epics, which were sung around in the various centers of Greek society. And again, to some degree, informed the Greeks of their particular values, their religious traditions. So the early Greek thought is shaped in that context.
Almost like verbal ritual. So, what happens with Socrates and Plato in writing?
I've never thought of that, I must confess. I presume these were oral events which were going on. They were question, answer, and so on. But obviously were being written down, and I suspect very carefully edited by Plato.
Yeah, Socrates, even though he says he doesn't write,
Yeah.
is already thinking and talking with the kind of language that only comes from writing.
With writing, yeah. Both the logic, all philosophical thought is really unthinkable in pre-alphabetic societies.
You don't have the reflective distance from language without the writing.
Yeah. Analytical, logical analysis is possible only when you have it there and it doesn't disappear with breath. You can go back, and you come back, and you come back. And so this is why it is so important in our schools that kids learn critical thinking. Above all, that's what civilizes us.
Yes, and the roots of critical thinking are built by learning to read and write, by recapitulating this whole historical process.
Right? Mm-hmm.
And so many children, because of the confusion, develop an avoidance to wanting to do it. That's what we're trying to do.
What you're addressing.
What we're addressing is the history of this as it's a technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a representation system that's become confused through this historical journey.
What can we do to simplify and to make more attractive this learning process for our youngsters?
That's what we're working on. That's one of the things we're working on. I mean, the historical attempts to change it have gone in four directions, really. There's been change the alphabet, change the spelling, teach children to imbibe it osmotically, the whole language movement, or phonics, which is kind of a patch to how to reconcile the letter and sound mess that's in the underlying code. Benjamin Franklin was involved in this, Noah Webster was involved with this, Melville Dewey was involved with this, William James, the who's who of American and English intellectual society banded together to try to change it. It's all exploded, and today, if you talk to the reading czar, the person that talks to the president of the United States about reading in America, and you mention that there's a difficulty with children learning this code, the idea that you can even think about the code in a certain way is considered folly. It's absurd. It's just not to be going. You're not supposed to go there.
I'm right now involved in two writing projects. One, which is to be published by the Oxford University Press, and the other, Harvard. Well, I have to do different types of spelling and two different types of punctuation. And this drives me crazy. I have to keep an English dictionary and an American English dictionary.
You need a couple of graduate students.
Yes. Well, I trust all this will be finally edited by somebody who knows better than I do. But I don't like a U in color, for example, but I have to put one in.
Theodore Roosevelt is quoted in some paper that's actually, I think, at Harvard, isn't it? I will not be responsible for these superfluous U's.
Oh, very good.
So is there anything else that, one part of our story is to say, look, the invention of the alphabet was like this explosive enabling technology that propelled the very roots of Western civilization. On the one side, the Hebrew, the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, all the things that would come from that. And on the other side, the Greeks. So our science, our philosophy, our morality, our law, our codification systems,
Yes.
our abstractions, all these things unfolded from our use of this technology. On the other hand, we haven't been smart stewards of this technology as a technology. It's been a historical collision of what the Romans left in England and who was the power at the time in England who decided, well, we better start using this. And when the French invasion happened and all these, what kind of type fonts did we have when the first printers came to England, and all these things are responsible for a kind of a mess and a confusion getting into this core writing system, and that this is the challenge that children face when they're 4, 5, 6 years old coming up to learn into this.
Well, the mess that you speak about really stems from traditionalist thinking. Again, I go back to Egypt. They had the alphabet, but they never used it because convention required that they use the system with all of the different symbols, one for 3 letters, one for 2 letters, one for 1 letter, and the style that could not be changed, despite the fact there, lying right in front of them, is an alphabet.
Institutional inertia.
Yeah, and again, tradition prevents us from doing a great deal of revision and improvement that we could do. We stick to our ways, and our highways we are in miles, not in kilometers. Why? Tradition. Irrational tradition. In science, we have to use metrics, and but in plumbing, we don't. Well, on the other hand, things do change. Things can be changed and improved, and there are always a few people who are prepared to spend a great deal of energy, time, and their lives in it. And I gather that you're one of those.
Time will tell, and that's the intention right now, is to make a case. Make the case. I mean, it's costing us nearly $1 trillion a year reading-related difficulties.
Wow.
Most of the people in prison, most of the people with various social pathologies have reading-related difficulties. Learning, if you have difficulty learning to read, it can cause you to become ashamed of your mind.
Yeah.
You become ashamed of your mind, it cuts you off from learning about yourself, about the world. If you get cut off from learning, you're all the more prone to fall into all kinds of trouble. So this is a problem that cuts right through our society at an economic level, for those that care about things that way. It cuts right through the developmental health of a massive amount of human beings. So yeah, we're telling the story from the first sticks, scratching on sticks and bones, right up to, the World Wide Web. And in between it, this particular code of all codes, the alphabet, how it evolved, and what kind of a challenge it represents to the human brain in trying to learn through it. Because the particular kind of confusion that we're talking about, the one that's been engendered in the English language, it's only a few hundred years old. There's no evolutionary precedent for this organism to be dealing with that mess. Right? It has to learn its way through. And it's like launching a space shuttle. For some people, they're well equipped and boom, they take off. But for an awful lot, they don't. And their whole life gets mangled because they don't.
Yeah.
And that's nuts. Do something about that.
Well, we wish you well.
Thank you. I think we had some great jewels. Is there anything else?
Not that I think of
Thank you.
Is there anything else that...
We were just talking about that. We were just
Oh,
talking about that, whether there was anything else we wanted to talk. Is there anything else about the alphabet, some story about its effect or creation myth, or I mean anything else about the alphabet that you find to be particularly interesting that you want to share?
One of the things that fascinates me is the evolution of the alphabet. A paleographer who wants to date an inscription does that by the shape of the letters, and he knows the preceding shape, the shape here, and the following shape. And one moves into the other. And if you have a couple of points which you can date, then you can get a typology of the scripts. This is the way the Dead Sea Scrolls were dated. In the case of the inscriptions I'm doing from Ashkelon now, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed that site in 604, the late winter of 604, and everything that is in that tell in the Strait of Destruction we can date to the late 7th century. So I've been able to work out a typology from about the 8th century down to the 4th century of the script changes in the Phoenician character. This means all kinds of inscriptions in Phoenician which have been dated wrongly or which have been dated correctly can be revised or accepted.
You got a new template, a new key, a new way to match against the other inscriptions and determine their dating.
And it's interesting, this kind of typological change also fits in the typology of ideas, so that historical thought, you see the same kind of change. Hegel tried to make it absolutely regular, which you have thesis, and then you have the antithesis, and then you have the synthesis between the two. This dialectic happens. In any case, there's always change in history, and this includes the alphabet and the script. And if you're interested in dating your document, all you have to do is to figure out exactly how that change is going and when.
You must look for a certain archetype of the letter that is relatively stable. I mean, you could look at her writing and my writing, and they would be incredibly different on these characters. So you must have some scribal regularity, enough scribal regularity to find.
There has to be there has to be continuity, or you would not recognize the letter if it changed too abruptly. You can't have abrupt change. It must be fairly slow change. The same is true with language. Language changes steadily, as we know. We know what Chaucer sounded like, and we know what we sound like, and it's a long way apart. In any case, this change is steady, and it can be dated. If you have objective points to date with, and the same is true in language. Pockets of conservatism in scripts and in language exist, usually, by the way, outside of the cities and the mountains, which slow things down, but still, there's a inevitable
the greater the density and frequency of exchange, the more rapid the pace of change, the evolutionary direction.
Yes, if you take language change takes place mostly in the cities, and look at our slang, which stems from New York and Chicago and Los Angeles largely, I suppose. Then it spreads out finally, slowly. But the change,
the marketeers get a hold of it.
And the meaning of words, how they change. What does cool mean?
Well, there's a question for the great philosophers.
I do have a question. When we speak to the reading and writing being used only by the elite, for the general society, can we put a date onto when the first children started to read? When children first started to read, how long ago was that? When was that?
I would have to guess. We have plenty of inscriptions on pottery, which were done by people who were learning. We have some learning tablets. There are many, many cases where we have the ABCs on documents. Some people think that has religious significance. I think they're school texts. But are they adults who are learning, or are they children? I'm not sure how you can tell. Adults can write poorly, and children can write well. So it's hard to date. But it must have occurred early in the history of the alphabet that writing and reading also moved down from adults and specialists to the population, and finally to children in the population. I would have to guess by the 10th century children were already beginning to work at this. They're curious. I have a little granddaughter who taught herself to read when she was, 4, I guess. And there were ancient Phoenician children who had similar curiosity and taught themselves to write, I'm sure.
Thank you. That's been wonderful. I really appreciate that.
Sorry?
This has been wonderful.
Well,
you voiced a couple of really beautiful jewels.
I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Let's get the lights cooling down, huh?
Ah, good.
Kind of warm being in that